Welcome everyone to the final installment of my IFR series. I'm going to do something a little bit differently for this one. I've been lucky enough that my instructor Allan agreed to sit down and talk through some guidance on preparing for the checkride, as well as just tips and tricks for instrument training in general. So I'm going to share some of the guidance he provided on the flights we did, and we're going to sit down and I'll ask him some questions about both those things. And we also had some viewers send in a few questions about IFR training in general, so I'll get him to opine on those as well. Hope you enjoyed this one. As always, if you like it, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Enjoy the video.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Allan. Background in education, so I used to be a teacher, and it was always kind of a dream for me to become a flight instructor. I never thought I could do it. I think you have to become a commercial pilot first, right? And I actually realized that a lot of my skills were transferable, obviously coming from teaching in the classroom and then teaching in the airplane, teaching in a ground school, and kind of fell in love with it. So been doing that for, I guess, 5 or 6 years now, and went right through from a class 4, which is how you start out as a flight instructor, all the way up to a class 1 that I am currently now. So I primarily teach flight instructors how to do the private pilot training. And additionally, I do the multi-engine IFR training as well.
You know, some pilots, when they get their PPL, go on right away to do advanced training, whether it's commercial, instrument, what have you, whereas others, like me, or even more so, wait and don't do the instrument rating until a bit later. Do you think there's any advantage to one versus the other in terms of people's ability to pick up those skills, or outcomes, or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Traditionally, yeah, it's something that quite often in the school environment, once the students completed the private, they go on to getting the night rating, which has an additional instrument training component. They do some additional training where we usually focus on teaching them a little bit more about radio navigation in addition to the basic fundamental skills. And then, of course, they're typically working on their commercial license and building as much cross-country PIC time as they can, right, to meet that instrument rating requirement of the 50 hours solo cross-country. But that usually results in the instrument rating coming much later in the training. Often they'll finish the commercial, and they'll have around 150 hours by the time they've done the written exam and the flight test, and then they'll move into the multi, and then they always finish with the IFR. And that typically goes fine, but that's not the only way. I know in the United States, for example, there are programs that will concurrently teach a pilot how to become a private pilot while at the same time working on their instrument rating. There's nothing like that in Canada, of course, but it goes to show you that I'm sure someone who's fresh out of their private license who wants to get an instrument rating would certainly be capable of doing that. In the world I'm in, which is more in the flight school, they can't get a job with a private pilot's license with an instrument rating, right? It's more for personal use. So I think the idea of doing it a little later for those folks is better because their instrument rating is more fresh. It's more at the front of their mind because that's what they've just completed their commercial license with.
Yeah.
And I can just say from myself, having spent 1,000 hours teaching, even though I wasn't flying the airplane the entire time, my awareness was heightened to a point so that when I was now working on my instrument rating, I was picking up things a lot more quickly.
Another viewer wrote in and was talking about his plane not being instrument rated. For pilots in that situation, do you think there's value in getting an instrument rating, like beyond flying through clouds or less than ideal weather? What sort of benefits does an instrument rating give you?
Yeah, well, I would say that it gives you a lot of skills that are transferable, okay? Because it really, the instrument training, what it's teaching you how to do is exercise, your pilot decision-making skills. It's teaching you how to multitask in a way that might be even more challenging than you do when you're flying VFR. There's stick and rudder skills. There's programming skills, with the GPS that can certainly help you VFR or VORs or ADF if your airplane is so equipped. So it's certainly a valuable skill to add to your arsenal. But to get the most out of it, it's a skill you need to continue practicing. To really master something, you need to practice it. And if the only chance you get to practice it is when you did the training, that skill is going to perish in time.
So just thinking about somebody who's getting ready to start their instrument training, a viewer wrote in and asked, are there sort of 3 or 4 skills or areas you suggest they really focus on to begin with, or something that a few characteristics that you think would set them up for success?
All right, so yeah, if you're looking to start your instrument training, I would say, first of all, meet with an instructor and come up with a plan. If you have a timeline, that's great, because that can keep you motivated to make bookings and come up with a schedule that's going to work for you. Once you've met with this instructor and you've seen the plan, I would start doing the appropriate readings for each lesson. So a common mistake I see when I give a student a syllabus is that the student shows up to the lesson and expects to just jump in the airplane. We're always going to have some form of a pre-flight briefing. If your instructor does not do this with you, you're not going to get as much out of the training session as you would have got if you had to spend 5 minutes talking about what it is you're going to do. So have a plan, stick with the plan, and do the readings.
Yeah.
And I would say focus on the fundamentals. Keep it simple. If you break down any instrument flight, it involves a takeoff, a landing, there's a climb, a level off, and a descent. And there's some turns in there. Okay, and pretty much every maneuver that you will do, every maneuver you do is a combination of those basic fundamentals. No matter how complicated it might seem, a procedure turn or a holding pattern, it's all based on those fundamental skills.
Yeah. For someone who's in the middle of their training, sometimes a student will hit a plateau. They're just kind of struggling to move on to that next lesson. Any suggestions or pointers for a student who's in that situation on how to break through to the next level?
Yeah, so the typical learning curve, a student will progress rapidly and then they'll plateau at some point. It's very common. Often it can be traced back to an issue with some basic element of the procedure, right? So there's just a small hitch that has gone undetected perhaps up to this point that is now becoming a major problem and is now needing to be corrected before you're able to move on. So the way we get through that, of course, is by thoroughly debriefing the flight. And those areas that are sticking points could then be attacked, like I say, with specific skills. So if one part of the approach is going wrong, don't just spend 15 minutes getting onto and doing the whole approach. Maybe just focus on that one element, whatever it is, maybe figuring out the descent rate to stay on the CDA, or getting the airspeed under control in the approach, and that'll usually fix the problem.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So obviously it was kind of an unusual flight. There were some other things that were going on, but to debrief the first part, there's a good lesson there and why it's important to brief the procedure. So what you would, your passenger briefing was excellent, by the way. I really liked it. But what you should be doing is doing that when you're getting in the airplane.
Yeah.
Or doing it before you start. So make sure that stuff's done then. When you're holding short, that's a time to brief what you're going to do in the event of an emergency. And it would also be the time to get the plate out and look at the plate, right? So you knew most of the stuff on the plate, because I asked you. I said, well, what altitude and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
And of course, the one question I did not ask that would have been answered by looking at the plate would have been answered by having briefed the plate, right? Because you wanted to fly a track.
Yeah.
He said, whatever, who cares? I mean, ultimately, you're the one who's briefing the plate, right? So it could have changed. Maybe the plate's been updated, and maybe now it hasn't. It's always been flight ahead, but it could happen, right? So that's a good reason why you always want to brief the plate. A really good lesson there. Yeah, so there was a couple interesting answers to problems I was posing. Like, I was trying to get you to notice that we were getting close to 5 minutes and that we were at 5 minutes. And you mentioned that, oh, he hasn't cleared me yet to do that. They won't normally. They'll wait until you get close, especially when there's traffic around. So, okay, well, someday this radio is going to break and you're going to be IFR. You're only going to have the one radio. So what would you do in that case?
I would ask him.
I just say to him, hey, I'd like to make my 5-minute call at the MF. I'd say that about 5 or 7 minutes out or something.
Yeah.
And he's going to say, yeah, that's fine. Switch over and then come back to me.
Okay.
Or just go get out of my hair and go over to it then, right?
Yeah.
But you wouldn't want to, with one radio, switch frequencies without telling them, because you might start,
Yeah.
where the hell are you?
Where are you? Yeah.
I would say most instructors are following some form of a checklist to keep themselves organized. And of course, not all students are going to go at the same rate. So that's one of the skills of the instructor, is they need to be able to analyze the student's performance and make a decision. Is the student ready to move on, or should they continue working on the previous lesson? It's probably that one of the number one causes of issues is moving on to things too quickly. And, we're all people pleasers, most of us instructors. We want to have clients who come to us, so we tend to want to tell people the good stuff. And we always want to emphasize what their people are doing well, but it's very important to focus on those areas where they need help, and then with some laser-like focus, just work on those areas. So if every flight is just, okay, well, we're going to go shoot the RNAV approach at airport A, and then we're going to return to airport B, and you're not seeing any skill progression, you might try focusing on certain elements of that flight and just focus on them. For example, a typical RNAV approach is basically just a series of turns with a constant descent at the end. So you don't have to go shoot an approach to do that somewhere. You can practice that up at altitude away from the busy airspace, and then once you've mastered the basics, you can then take it and put it into the procedure.
Yeah. I consider myself lucky that in my training I got to fly in real IMC a number of times. But can you talk about whether you think it's important, or how important it is for a student to get some real IMC experience during the instrument training process?
Yeah, well, I think if the opportunity presents itself and it's safe and it's within the personal limits for both the student and instructor, then yeah, go for it. We were fortunate. We were doing our training during a time of year when it was plenty warm enough, so we were able to experience some real IMC. There's no substitute for that. So as much as I want to say, oh, it's okay if you don't ever get to try real IMC in your training, it really is necessary, I think, in some regards, because it's very different. I mean, in theory, it's the same whether you're wearing a hood or you're in the cloud. I mean, you're supposed to only be looking at the instruments, but as well as I, as soon as you get in the cloud, the hood does not cover everything. You could still peek, and you can't help but have different sensations in the cloud, because now you're kind of being jostled around. Usually it's not always smooth. So that there is no replacing that experience. Like I've done the Redbird simulator, the motion simulator, and as good a job as they do, it does not replicate the sensation of being in the clouds for the first time. I think part of it is mentally, just knowing that if you did look outside, you wouldn't see anything. And for me, that was always the secret when I was actually flying in IMC, was just don't look outside. As soon as you start looking outside, you will become disoriented. It's incredible. So yeah, seek out a instructor or somebody who is IFR current. If you did complete the training and didn't get the experience, you generally shouldn't go into the clouds the first time on your own. It'd be much better to have somebody with you who's been there and done that.
Yeah, it was really good flight. You look totally ready to me.
That one felt good.
The holds, I think we cleared up and did that every which way, and no issues with that. So approaches are real solid, procedures are solid, emergency checklist knowledge is good, and I've thrown you a few curveballs with emergencies, and we told you a couple things maybe they didn't know. But yeah, I think you're totally ready.
For someone who's a little bit further along in their training, and they're kind of at the point where they're starting to prep for the check ride, what do you look for in a student that makes you think, yes, this person is ready to do the check ride?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I find that when I start having to find things to say, that's an indication that, wow, this student is really putting it all together here, and they're doing most things on their own. Another one would be, for me, when they are self-aware that they're starting to get behind the airplane and they take actions to then get ahead of the airplane. For me, that's a big sign that, oh, wow, this guy or gal, they're getting really close here, because they're totally aware of what's happening. It's rare, it doesn't happen often, but if you're really flying IFR and you're really getting behind that 8 ball and you've been cleared that approach, requesting a hold at that initial approach fix, that is a sign of somebody to me who is completely aware that they're running behind and they're not about to get pushed into an approach that they're not ready for.
Yeah.
So I would typically look for those sorts of signs. I find the student who is insisting they're ready sometimes is not the one who's actually ready. It's quite often the one who thinks they need more work, who actually takes a little coaxing to do the test. Those are the ones who are usually ready.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know as I was kind of getting deeper into the training and you started saying things like, oh, you're getting close. I felt like every time we went up, I'd make some new mistake, right? Like whether it was, I didn't turn in time from the initial approach fix to the final or something like that. And then on the next flight, you'd call that out. On the next flight, I'd fix that, and I'd make a different mistake the next time. And it felt like I was kind of struggling to put it all together. There's always seemed to be something. Is that something that you see often? Is that something that as people are getting ready, there's always one little thing that's kind of holding them back?
Very common, yeah. So mastery of any skill, it's I'm not going to say it's easy, but most people can get it to the 80 to 95% level. But to get it that extra 5% takes a huge amount of effort, sometimes far more effort than it took to get up to that 80% level. Think of the juggler learning to juggle the extra of that final ball. He can juggle, the other 8 perfectly fine, but he adds that 9th ball and they all go flying, and his goal is 9. So yeah, typically towards the end of the training, there's now so few errors that we're correcting that when those little ones do creep up, it'll seem like more of a setback than it really is. These are minor errors that we're now correcting last that are surfacing usually.
Yeah.
I got to brush up on unusual approaches. Like I haven't even thought about contact. Even visual approaches is not something I really think about.
Yeah, well, send me that, or don't send me. Take a look at that thing I sent you, and then start building like a little plan to kind of review those items, because he's going to ask you some of them.
Yeah.
That'll be the basis of a good review to get ready for the test.
All right.
For a student who's kind of getting ready for the check ride, can you talk a little bit about what the examiner is looking for? Not necessarily the process they follow or the checks they're trying, the boxes they're trying to check, but what are they looking for in a candidate that makes them say, yes, this person is ready to hold an instrument rating?
Yeah, absolutely. I do the same thing when I recommend a student for the flight test. I'm thinking exactly what the examiner would be. I don't have the privilege to sign them off, but it's just as important to me to get it right. So one of the big questions I ask, is this person safe to go flying? Would I trust them to take my significant other or my child with them on a flight somewhere? And if I can answer yes to that, that is, one of the big things, I would say. Pilot decision making, so you'll be assessed on that, and we talk about that throughout the instrument rating. But there's a very good chance, especially if your flight test is in the winter, that you would actually not be going to do this flight. So being able to talk through your own decision making process as to how you came to that decision is very important. They're obviously looking for competency with hands and feet, but if the airplane is so equipped, such as with an autopilot, they want to see you use it. So they're not going to tell you, oh, you have to turn the autopilot off for this whole trip. They're going to let you use it, but you can bet at some point they're going to test your knowledge of that system and what would happen if that system stopped working.
Yeah. For a new instrument rated pilot, can you talk a little bit about personal minimums? Are there anything you consider reasonable for a new pilot to be thinking about in terms of personal minimums?
Yeah, so I immediately think of taking off into bad weather. I always want to consider that, I've just done my good thorough run up and everything's working properly. What happens if I take off and I have an issue? Or, maybe you're going somewhere and you realize I just forgot my passport. I now have to land at the place I just took off. I definitely want the weather at my departure to be well above the landing minimums, because there I might need to come back. And that could get you into a whole nother discussion on takeoff alternates. But if I have an issue after takeoff, I definitely do not want to be setting on a cross-country flight to some alternate.
Yeah.
So for me, the weather at the departure needs to be even better than normal.
Yeah.
En route, if I'm even questioning what the weather is looking like at my destination, I'm starting to think about alternate airports. And it might be airports other than my alternate. Okay, that legal alternate is important. Obviously, it should be maintained. But if I have a better option that's going to get me into a VFR approach as opposed to an approach in low IFR or even just regular IFR, I'm going to be very tempted to go to that VFR airport.
Yeah.
And I would always suggest, picking alternates that are sure things. I would never be going just by the published minima. I want way better than the published minima for my alternate, especially in a light airplane.
Right. It's interesting in Canada, I'm not familiar with the details of the U.S. instrument requirements, but I know that their takeoff minimum are a little bit different. They actually have cloud height minimum requirements to take off in the U.S. In Canada, it's just visibility, right? Half mile, you're legal to take off. I've never understood that because of what you said, right? Like, what if you take off and there's an issue and you have to turn around and come back, and all of a sudden you can't? It seems like an odd decision.
It goes to show you that, you really need to be cognizant of the fact that there are differences when you cross the border, and you definitely want to pre-plan that trip and consider all those alternatives.
Yeah. It's an interesting question for somebody who's not flown instrument in the U.S. before. I haven't looked into their currency requirements. Are they pretty similar to what they are?
If you look up their requirements, they're different. They also specify a hold.
Oh.
You're supposed to have done a hold.
Okay.
But it doesn't get any specifics like how many holds or how many laps around the hole. It just says you have to have done a hold.
Yeah.
So it's odd, but it's the same thing. Like, you're good for a year, 13 months or whatever from your flight test.
Yeah.
First day of the 13th month.
Yeah.
And then after that.
For somebody who's instrument rated in Canada and then flies down to the U.S. for a trip, do they need to meet the U.S. currency requirements, or if they meet the Canadian, it's okay?
You need to meet the U.S. IFR currency requirements. So I would take a look at it. I mean, you're current right now because you just did a flight test.
Yeah. All right. Any sort of final thoughts or suggestions for someone considering an instrument rating?
I would talk to people who've recently gone through the process and have gotten the instrument rating. Talk to a flight instructor, maybe the flight instructor who did your private license. Research, come up with a list of questions before you begin, and ask yourself, what's the purpose that I want to get this instrument rating? Is it just because I want to improve my proficiency overall, or am I going to be using this because I'm buying an airplane that's going to be IFR certified and I've got a specific mission that I'm looking to accomplish? Set out a clear plan.
That's it for my IFR series. I hope you enjoyed it. For those of you who already have your instrument rating, I hope it brought back some fun memories. And for those who don't, I hope it inspired a few of you to go find an instructor and get started. A really big thank you to Allan for letting me use the videos and sitting down with me for the interview and all his input along the way. I couldn't have done this without him. Thanks again for watching. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't. I'll see you in the next one, and in the meantime, fly safe.